Greetings and welcome to In Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. We are here at the Government Campus Plaza Auditorium where we just witnessed the College of Science, Technology and Applied Arts of Trinidad and Tobago, COSTAATT, their inaugural lecture of the Resilience and Innovation Public Lecture Series. Now, the feature speaker, Dr. Betilde Muñoz-Pogossian, Director of the Department of Social Inclusion at the Organization of the American States Secretariat for Access to Rights and Equity. She is having a conversation with us. We're looking forward to it. Dr. Muñoz-Pogossian, we want to thank you so much for actually making the time. And after the interaction, the engagement that you had at this inaugural lecture series, what are some of the takeaways that you had? Because I saw you taking notes.
Oh, yes.
So in terms of even the way the lecture went or your feature speech went, and then the engagement both from the panelists and members of the audience.
Thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to share with you and your viewers about the lecture we just concluded on rights-based approaches to addressing Venezuelan migration, not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but we also took a look at a regional perspective and what is happening in different countries of the region. There's many issues that we touched upon, but if there's two or three takeaways, as you are saying, that resonated with me as I was, in the discussion and I was participating in the panel. The first one would definitely be the fact that it is often easier to criticize and point out the things that are not being done or that could be done better. And don't take me wrong. We need to be reflective and we need to see how we can improve social policies and all policies to receive and integrate migrants and refugees. But I was actually very glad to hear, not just from one or two, but for more than three participants, that in Trinidad and Tobago there are very interesting policy innovations that are being done to receive and integrate Venezuelan migrants and refugees, and with the invitation to continue building up on those and seeing what could be done better. So that's definitely one. At the same time, I was also glad to see the connection between what I call the ecosystem of actors working on migration, not just governments, or in this particular case, the government of Trinidad and Tobago, but how the response is also being given by NGOs, church organizations, academia, COSTAATT itself, and also regional, international, and international NGOs like PADF that also participated in the panel with us today, and how collectively they can provide security, guarantee the rights and inclusion of migrants and refugees communities. And the third and last key takeaway, and this is kind of like homework for me as a member of the Organization of American States, is to see how we can facilitate dialogue at the regional level via not just the current or the existing cooperation mechanisms that we have in place, but perhaps tailoring some of those to the particular needs of island states, because we also covered the reality of not just Trinidad and Tobago, but other island states like the Dominican Republic, Aruba and Curacao, although of course they have a particular jurisdiction and political status, but small islands or islands that are receiving this migrant and refugee population that are putting pressures on the usual social services that they had for their populations. What are the particular challenges that these countries face, and what are the particular opportunities that may arise from the arrival of Venezuelan migrants and refugees?
With that, I want to talk a little bit about nuance and narrative and the use of language, because certain words have different connotations. So some people would say that growth focuses more on money, development focuses more on people. You gave an idea of that sort of nuance in your address when you were talking about human migration and how that focuses more on individuals. Take us through that, please.
Well, there's a couple of elements that come to mind when I hear your question. Number one, and on the issue of narratives, how we all need to see migration not as a problem. We need to contain ourselves and not say migration is a problem. No, migration is a phenomenon. It's a fact of life. Countries in the Americas have been countries of origin, countries of transit, countries of destination, countries of return. Most of us, of our countries in the region, have been put together with migrants and refugees and definitely migrants. So to understand migration not as a problem and to not use the language of migration as a problem, but as an opportunity and as a fact of life, and that we need to, of course, know how to respond well to make the most of it. And the second element is how to never forget we're talking about people. So a rights-based approach to migration means that we need to be conscious of the particular realities that these people bring, that these are not just averages, numbers, statistics. We are talking about people with desires, goals, with really a motivation to make it in a new environment, to give a better situation for themselves and their families. And we have to be very, very aware of that at the time of designing, implementing, and hopefully evaluating the policies that we develop.
With that in mind, how important is it to have all hands on deck with regard to getting information? Because sometimes you may be in the position of being able to make policies, but because you don't have all the perceptions or the information factors that should go into making a policy, there are oversights that happen sometimes.
Yes.
So in terms of CSOs, CBOs, everyone who is engaged at different levels, different tiers, having them be part of the policy making that is going on.
The key issue is inclusion, and inclusion, right? And that means that when devising these policies to address the particular challenges that migration might bring and how best to take advantage of these arrivals, we need to be inclusive of the populations that are going to benefit themselves. Meaning, be creative, think out of the box, and think of processes where you consult with these communities, and they are the ones telling you, these are the needs, these are the challenges, this is a very concrete solution that I can think of. Make them part of designing the solutions. But you can never, you should also include the communities that are receiving them, because we often see that this resistance and discrimination or xenophobia that may arise is because all the attention is being given to the migrant and refugee. We need to also be conscious of the realities of the receiving communities. And as you say, ensure that you have the input from civil society organizations, the churches, the academia, because we all have a role to play.
And with that, we take a short break. We come back, we continue this conversation. Stay with us, we return with more. Welcome back. We are having a discussion with Dr. Betilde Muñoz-Pogossian, and a little earlier in the conversation, you spoke about sometimes curbing our enthusiasm. How does that manifest operating from OAS, interacting with different jurisdictions? So we may say, okay, this might work, but you are interacting with individuals, knowing that they are sovereign entities. So what do conversations like that happen like at times?
That's an excellent question. And I always say that even from the standpoint of the OAS, we have to respect the sovereignty of the countries that are receiving migrants and how they are solving and managing their own social pact or social contract, as they say, right? When dealing with migration and designing public policies for migration and forced displacement, all countries usually have to reconcile this dilemma in terms of how to protect borders and the sovereignty and ensure that they know who is coming in. And that is legitimate. All countries have the right to be able to do this. And the other side of that dilemma is how to protect human rights. And often, one wins over the other, but ideally, when what we hope to support the member states of the OAS in doing is how to achieve the perfect balance, where their sovereignty is respected, they're able to protect their borders, they're able to know who's coming in, who's coming out, who needs to be out, right? At the same time, ensuring that all attention, all resources are not put on that, but that they're also vested in terms of protecting the rights of migrants and refugees, and especially the most vulnerable of them, women, children, adolescents, and the like.
And I think that may have been some of the things discussed at the recently held Joint Meeting Committee on Juridical and Political Affairs, Committee on Hemispheric Security. But there's something that you shared in your presentation when you said that regularization is the entry door.
Yes.
To, is it other rights?
Yes, that's how I always say that.
Expand on that.
Regularization is the entry door to the enjoyment of all other rights. And what I mean by this, when you are regularized, you exist. You have an ID card. There's a record that says that Betilde Muñoz exists and she's living in this country. What often happens is that migrants who cross irregularly, either land borders or they do it via maritime ways, they stay in the shadows. They stay in the limbo. They don't exist, and therefore it's very difficult for them to access all other rights. And when I say all other rights, I mean the right to education, the right to a dignified job, the right to access health care. So many of the rights contained in juridical instruments that are at the OAS, that we at the OAS use as our navigation chart. Once you regularize and you have an ID that says that you are here, you have a better chance, even though with the difficulties and challenges that may happen, to accessing health, education, jobs, etc., etc.
And you're saying this, and this reminds me of something that someone said years ago, but it stayed with me, that access requires acknowledgement.
Exactly.
So if I'm shouting at the top of my voice and you just refuse to acknowledge my existence, sometimes it's almost as though like you ask the question whether or not the tree in the forest falls and no one hears it. But
absolutely.
Looking at there may be things that you may not want to legislate every single thing. But if you take certain principles into account, it may help with how things are worded, how narrative is carried. And I think you shared some principles, 5 principles.
Yes.
What are some of those?
Well, the key one is the principle of non-discrimination, and it's this idea that you should offer program services to all people regardless of their migratory status, regardless of their race, their gender identity, their sex, their disability, their age, right? And this is this idea that you have to make it available to all. Another principle that I mentioned is a gender-based approach. And I know this has, there's a lot of controversies around the issue of gender, but 1980s definition by the UN on a gender perspective purely means that when looking at a situation and when thinking of solutions, you are able to see how men and women experience reality differently, and how certain things that may be easier for a woman are more difficult for men, or things that are easier for men are more difficult for a woman. And there's also an important level of responsibilities and stereotypes that tend to prevent women from accessing all opportunities. So having a gender approach to migratory policies means being conscious that a female migrant is going to have more difficulties perhaps going to a government office to get her ID, because at the time that is open when she has to be taking care of her kids. These minor things that we take as a given, but when you have a gender approach, you are more aware of. And the last one that is also one that I mentioned in my lecture is to ensure that the best interest of the children, of the child, is considered when devising policies. And an example of this, and I'm not going to go into any detail, but you had situations in the U.S.-Mexico border when children have been separated from their families. Having this consciousness of the best interest of the child would definitely guarantee thinking out of the box, finding innovative ways to ensure that the family is not separated. No? Just to give you a very concrete example, and that is widely known. So these are some of the principles that I mentioned.
Thank you so much. And also not asking you to go into detail about this or speak about a specific jurisdiction, but sometimes it feels as though many people want to help. So they've started something, and sometimes it feels as though there can be a lot of duplication. But in wrapping up the panel discussion, you said you saw some opportunities for things that can now be addressed.
Yes.
What are some of those things?
Well, I share your view that there's a lot of duplication happening in terms of responses to migration and to migrants and refugees. The good thing of that is there's good intentions behind it. There's like positive will of different people and organizations and governments to do something about it. And I believe that has to encourage us, right? But yes, there is indeed duplication. There's efforts that could be definitely have much more of an impact, but because they're happening in a dispersed manner, we see that they don't have that kind of impact, right? And in that regard, I think it's crucial to have very positive, constructive collaboration between governments and NGOs, because NGOs, in my view, generally close the gap in the response that the government, even though they may have the best intention to provide, they don't have the capacity because resources are finite, so they're limited. And the NGOs, the regional and international organizations can help in closing the gaps in the response. So that's definitely one. And secondly, and this is something that we were talking about, how to take more advantage of the different policies that are happening in the region with the pertinent adaptations, because we cannot just impose a model that worked in Colombia into Trinidad or one that worked in Brazil in the United States, but try to create opportunities for that learning, to create opportunities, because they also give inspiration for us to think of new solutions. And I believe, and again, particularly to the case of island states, it's very important that we generate a discussion on policies, on challenges, but also on opportunities.
And one of the things with regard to community-based organizations closing the gap is that many times they're closer to the situation, so they're able to see what is happening from a different level and be able to address it like that. But with that in mind, I also appreciated, I can't remember the jurisdiction that you spoke about, but looking at local government taking some of these things on board with regard to helping with
in Chile.
English, Chile, thank you.
No, in English.
English as a second language,
yes.
as well as providing opportunities to build a capacity while providing meaningful employment. Because like you said, many people, they're grateful for the handout because it's necessary. But in terms of what you want to
feel
the
empowered.
opportunity to say, okay, well, I am
Contribute.
working and I am supporting my family the way that I want to, the way that I would have, the way that I left where I was to be able to. But hardest question for this conversation, how important, or what's the significance of a body like COSTAATT having a conversation like this?
I think the beginning of that response is this idea of an ecosystem of actors to respond to Venezuela and to migration and to the arrival of migrants and refugees, where all have a role to play, right? And I want to commend COSTAATT for the initiative to bring this conversation, to initiate a dialogue on how best to design or continue improving rights-based policies to integrate, to receive migrants and refugees. They have taken this very seriously, trying to complement other initiatives that are happening in Trinidad and Tobago, trying to systematize knowledge and share it in this forum that we had today, to ensure that from now on the responses are conscious of the rights of people and that they make the countries able to make the best out of their arrival.
And finally, what's the line of communication? Is it that actors on the ground in a specific jurisdiction try to have conversations with persons a little higher up the quote-unquote food chain, or do they reach out directly to the Department of Inclusion, OAS? What is that conversation like?
Well, there's two key points of communication that ended up, us being here today. One is through our colleague and representative of the OAS in St. Lucia, who made a connection with COSTAATT and other colleges and brought, where they brought this idea, the colleagues from COSTAATT, on how to do a lecture series on human rights and resilience and innovation, combined with the fact that at the OAS, in the department that I lead, we have for 4 years put together a digital diploma on leadership for social inclusion and access to rights, in which colleagues from COSTAATT, professors from the department, participated. And after them having participated in the program, they realized that there's such a richness in knowledge in the region that needs to be brought to Trinidad and Tobago. And a combination of that, and as my colleague Professor Kieran said, affinity of vibes and commitments and values made us achieve what we did today with this lecture.
And with that, we want to thank you so much for your presence and your insight and just taking the time to share again Dr. Betilde Muñoz-Pogossian, and on behalf of the entire TTT News team, this has been In Depth with me, Dike Rostant. Thank you so much for joining us.